Yesterday I said we'd spend some time talking about Birmingham because it's a pivotal game changer in the civil rights movement. You could almost say, and I'm about to say, that the civil rights movement started officially with the Brown versus the Board of Education case, which I said is something that changed the way the situation was. The Brown decision is so important because segregation and with it discrimination was really the law of the land ever since 1896. That separate but equal doctrine of the Plessy versus Ferguson case. And the Brown decision overturned that by a 9-0 ruling, said no, separate is not equal, and it violates the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, which opened up the floodgates for all of the protests that we talked about. And there were many of them. There was Little Rock schools, there was the University of Mississippi, there were the Freedom Riders on the buses, there were the lunch counter sit-ins, there were all those things, the Montgomery bus boycott, everything we've talked about. But a pivotal secondary game changer within that was the demonstrations at Birmingham, Alabama in the spring and into the summer of 1963. So the Southern Christian Leadership Conference decided to stage protests at Birmingham. I don't know how you can say this because the entire area was segregated, but one of the quote-unquote most segregated cities in America. And what they were trying to do was a broad-based thing that would allow African Americans to shop at the stores of Birmingham, to work within those stores at Birmingham, to use the restaurants, eat there, go to various other facilities, also have employment there. In other words, full-on equality. And a series of sit-ins and stand-ins and standing on the sidewalk kind of protests, nonviolent civil disobedience, again, not necessarily illegal except in the manner in which you may do them. You're not allowed in this store, you can't come into this store, would make it illegal. It's not illegal to go into a store, but it's illegal in our law for you to go into this store. So a series of those kinds of things were set up, and in fact, they were intended to provoke mass arrests, to call attention to the situation. And here you see the police and the crowd of African Americans in downtown Birmingham. As it turned out, many of the protesters were arrested, and Martin Luther King, who was brought in as the leader of the SCLC to sort of spearhead this protest, was also arrested. And while he was arrested, he wrote a very, very famous document called the Letter from the Birmingham Jail. If you want to read the letter from the Birmingham Jail, when you get this PowerPoint description set of notes, you can click on the link there and it takes you right to the text of that letter. Basically, he said that these protests are not causing the racial tensions that you see. The racial tensions have always been there. We are calling attention to them. We are opening them up for people to see, but it's not tension that was not there. People say to wait, but how much longer would you think would be an appropriate time for us to wait to bring change? And by saying that they were going to illustrate what was going on in the Jim Crow South to the world, he was exactly spot on. The safety director of Birmingham was a man by the name of Bull Connor. Bull Connor was minorly famous as a play-by-play sports radio guy, but he had his real career was being a very stern, very strong, very segregationist safety director in Birmingham, and he had specific tactics to stop this type of protest in its in its tracks. And one was by use of police dogs, and those are stills, but you can see the German Shepherds and Alsatians, in this case, ripping the guy's pants off of his leg, but clearly being able to rip some flesh off of people's legs as well. And you can see that they are sicking these dogs on the African Americans in the three pictures there, and there'll be some footage you can see later. So that was one of his tactics. And the other tactic was the use of a high-powered fire hose. And here again, you could blow a 170-pound man probably 100 yards across a field with the force of a fire hose. And you can see it's knocking these people down and literally washing them out of the street. Now this was kind of ironic because obviously this is very ferocious response. But ironically, it gave the protests kind of new life, not because the protesters liked it so much, but because it publicized it so blatantly. We've talked about the rise of television as the medium that gave people their window, literally window onto the world from their houses. And TV is what it is now, but it was more than that 50 years ago because there wasn't other media. There was no electronic device in everybody's hand or on everybody's tabletop. And if you wanted that window to the outside world, you'd go and park in front of the TV set. And people did park in front of the TV set. And because it was the main source, the evening news, usually a half an hour, sometimes an hour broadcast of the news, of the day's news, was something that people watched regularly. And now, in May of 1963, as they sit down to dinner and turn on the evening news, they see children being attacked by German Shepherds, and they see children being swept off the street with a high-powered fire hose, and people have a tendency in Huntsburg and Middlefield and Parkman and Cleveland and Pittsburgh and all kinds of places around the country to say, what in the world is going on that would cause them to attack these kids in this way? In the midst of all this, the governor of Georgia, a man by the name of George Wallace, declares about this protest to desegregate Birmingham. He says, I draw a line. Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever. So he did draw a line in the sand. This is where we're gonna fight it out, and we're not giving in to you. Well, all this caught President John Kennedy's attention. He sees it on the evening news too. He is briefed every day as to what's going on, and he is briefed on what George Wallace has to say about the matter. Understand that now, segregation, now and forever, is not the law of the land anymore because of the Brown decision and everything that has come after that. And so Kennedy schedules time and he goes on national television to make a major talk to the nation, and he says that tonight he's going to introduce a new civil rights bill, the most extensive civil rights legislation since the times of Reconstruction right after the Civil War. He talks about this as a moral issue and a constitutional issue, and that it was 100 years ago, and it was exactly 100 years since the Emancipation Proclamation. It was 100 years have passed since Lincoln freed the slaves, yet their grandchildren are not truly free. And we're going to right that wrong now. So now what has happened is that these protests that had national attention, but happen in places throughout the South, in Greensboro, North Carolina, Albany, Georgia, Montgomery, Alabama, places like that, now become not only national news, but a national cause. Kennedy, to be kind of honest, had tread kind of a fine line because remember, we still have the solid Democratic South politically, and Kennedy is a Democrat. So he's walking on eggshells politically, but clearly he's not a segregationist, and he's had enough. And he says the Civil Rights Bill is going to be something we're going to pass. Now, it's not clear when he says all this that it's going to get passed by Congress because there's many people, the solid South among them, that is not in favor of this kind of thing. Kennedy says there's no wrong time to right a wrong. It's the right time to right a wrong, and off they go. With that, and to give it support, and it's not necessarily clear that Kennedy thought this was going to help in terms of support. We may remember A. Philip Randolph from the days before World War I planning a march on Washington to open federal employment and defense factories to African Americans, and how President Franklin Roosevelt agreed with Randolph, disagreed on do we want to march right here at this time as we are possibly, and it turned out were, heading into war, and he issued an executive order that created the Fair Employment Practices Committee, which then after the war became the commission, a permanent entity, and up until that time was the most major civil rights statement by the national government since Reconstruction. The march had never happened, but it's still near and dear to Randolph's heart, and he revives the idea now, 22 years later, that we're going to have a march on Washington, draw national support to this Civil Rights Act. And so in late August of 1963, the March on Washington becomes a reality, and 250,000 to 500,000, estimated conservatively at 250,000, 250,000 people descend on Washington, where they gather on the National Mall, and there you see the picture, another picture of it, and where they witness Martin Luther King's very stirring "I Have a Dream" speech. There's part of the text of it, in which he basically lays out his vision for equality in America. He wants the Declaration of Independence to have real meaning at this time, that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. He's talking about true equality here. Here again, if you'd like to hear the speech, you can click on this link on this slide and go right to the speech. So what does that do? Well, it fires up some people, but it fires up some people in exactly the way that you wouldn't want them fired up. There's plenty of people like Governor Wallace of Alabama who's going to hold the line. Segregation now and segregation forever. So battle has been joined, and it's going to have to be won in Congress. J. Edgar Hoover of the FBI, Federal Bureau of Investigation, considered Martin Luther King as the most dangerous and effective leader in the country, and could do the most to disrupt the status quo. Status quo meaning the way things are. And certainly that was King's intention, is to upset the status quo. And so there's this battle going on in Congress, and things percolate in Congress not that fast as we see every day. And in the fall of 1963, a major stumbling block occurs, a major tragedy occurs when President Kennedy is assassinated in Dallas. He is the big push for this bill. Many congressmen are looking for a way to not have to take a stand on this, and in particular, the southern bloc of the solid South Democrats are dead set against it. And now Kennedy, who is the person who is spearheading this, has been assassinated. The new president is Lyndon Johnson of Texas, one of the old Confederate states, a Southerner, but strongly in favor of civil rights. A strong advocate of civil rights and a strong advocate of this particular proposed legislation. There he is on the way back from Dallas, Jackie Kennedy by his side, his wife by his other side. and taking the oath of office. And in the really very first address he made to Congress, only 5 days after Kennedy was killed, Johnson does something pretty clever here as a tactic to get this bill passed. He says, no memorial could honor President Kennedy's memory than passing this bill, which he has crusaded for, because it's the right thing for us to do and the right time for us to do it. He took that position, which was a pretty effective one, and then used his background in Congress to strong-arm Congress people to vote for the bill. And long story short, on July 2nd, 1964, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed. Very, very far-reaching bit of legislation. Has been called, along with the GI Bill, one of the two most important pieces of legislation of the 20th century. It made segregation illegal in places of, the phrase is, public accommodation, a train station, a bus station, but also your restaurant. You say, well, it's my restaurant. Well, you're open to business and you open your doors to the public, and the public walks in and you can say, well, you can come in, but you can't. And the Civil Rights Act says yes, you're a private business. You are McDonald's, you are Burger King, or your mom and pop's diner. Doesn't matter. You're open to all comers, and yet you want to pick and choose who those comers are. You can't do that. It prohibited discrimination in the workplace. It created the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, EEOC. You still see that. You'll see it more as you start applying for jobs. Almost every form of de jure, by law, segregation and discrimination is now illegal. Very, very important and to be known by you. This is 10 years after the Brown case. So a decade has gone by, and it's sort of like putting yeast in bread dough. It's risen and it's ready to go. They have accomplished the main thing they set out to do, which is to do away with this two-tiered system by changing the law. Now, we're not going to walk our way through the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Well worth walking our way through. A lot of violence, a lot of opposition, more George Wallace, more Bull Connor, more Martin Luther King, more other people protesting. But I think it's safe to say that the Voting Rights Act would have never been passed if the Civil Rights Act had not been passed the year before. But if we go back again to those two court cases of the 1890s, Williams versus Mississippi set up a voting system that excluded African Americans, which is one of the underpinnings of the whole Jim Crow system. And the other decision, Plessy versus Ferguson, set up the segregated, two-tiered kind of society, separate but not equal society. And certainly the gates were opened by the Brown case in 1954, but now in 2 years, in 1964, you have the Civil Rights Act basically completely guts any semblance of separate but equal. And now the next year, the Voting Rights Act, which President Johnson is a strong sponsor of that as well, undoes all of that sort of discrimination. The poll tax by constitutional amendment was rendered illegal in 1964, so that there has been de jure, by law, a revolution, a second Reconstruction-like revolution, putting teeth into the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment 100 years later. All right, we'll stop from there. You can walk your way through the rest of this. When we talk about the civil rights movement in the later 1960s, we'll talk about how some of these achievements fray just a little bit in that the movement changes because the opposition changes. All right. I will post this and some other resources for you on your Google Classroom. Talk to you later.